The altar stone was cold enough to see his breath. Fray Tomás de Aguilar set down his quill. In the Florentine Codex Book 2, he had transcribed the words of Tenochtitlan's high priests. Only through death does the divine enter the mortal shell. They were describing a practice that had killed, by most estimates, 20,000 human beings in a single ceremonial cycle. And yet, according to Aztec cosmology, each one of those victims did not perish. They ascended. They became gods. In temples from the Mississippi Valley to the highlands of Mesoamerica, from the steppes of ancient Scythia to the rainforests of Southeast Asia, a pattern emerges. Certain humans, the sacrificed, the self-offered, the ritually killed, were not simply destroyed. They were transformed. Ancient sources describe figures who died on altars, crossed rivers, or hung from sacred trees and emerged as something no longer human. They became gods. They became stars. They became the sun itself. For centuries, scholars dismissed these accounts as primitive superstition, but the archaeological record tells a stranger story. The evidence suggests that across radically different cultures, the line between human sacrifice and human deification was deliberately, carefully blurred. And the question that haunts this evidence is one we have never fully answered. What did these ancient people actually believe was happening in those final moments? Consider the Aztec concept of times ixiptla, times a word that resists easy translation. It meant roughly the representation or the vessel. But it implied something far more radical. When a captive was chosen for sacrifice during the festival of Tlaloc, he was not merely killed. He was times made into times the god. For months before the ritual, he wore the god's clothing, ate the god's food, received the compay, God's worship. Priests addressed him as Tlaloc. People bowed before him. And on the day of sacrifice, when obsidian blades opened his chest, the Aztecs did not believe they were murdering a prisoner. They believed they were times killing a god times, and in that act of killing, releasing the divine force that would sustain the world for another year. The victim, by this logic, did not die as a man. He died as the god himself. The Aztec word for this transformation was times Nepantla, the place between. Death was not an ending, it was a doorway. But the Aztecs were not alone. In the Indus Valley, seals dating to 2600 BC depict figures in tree pose surrounded by offerings, a motif that comparative mythologists link to later Vedic texts describing times Purushamedha, the human sacrifice that generates the universe. The Rig Veda describes the primordial being Purusha, whose sacrifice created the world. When they divided Purusha, how many portions did they make? The answer, in the original Sanskrit, is telling. They made times 4. The gods did not simply kill him, they times distributed times him. His breath became the wind. His eyes became the sun. His mind became the moon. His body became the earth. Here again, sacrifice is not destruction. It is times dissemination, times the scattering of a divine substance that becomes the fabric of reality itself. The sacrificed human does not vanish. He times multiplies. Moving north and east, the pattern repeats with eerie consistency. In ancient Norse tradition, the god Odin hanged himself from Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and 9 nights. He pierced himself with his own spear. He sacrificed himself to himself. And in that act of self-offering, he gained the wisdom of the runes, the secret alphabet that gave humanity access to magic, poetry, and the hidden structure of existence. The Havamal, a Viking-era poem preserved in the Codex Regius, records Odin's own words. I know that I hung on the wind-tossed tree, 9 nights in all, wounded by a spear, and offered to Odin, myself to myself. Notice the grammar. Offered to Odin, myself to myself. The one who sacrifices and the one who receives are the same being. The sacrifice is an internal act, a god making itself through its own destruction. And if Odin was once human acclaim made in several Norse sources, then this is not just mythology. It is a recipe. Die in the right way, at the right tree, and you become divine. But here is where the evidence becomes genuinely strange. Archaeological findings from Iron Age Europe, particularly at sites like the bog bodies of northern Germany and the Netherlands, suggest that certain humans were killed in ritual contexts and their bodies preserved with extraordinary care. The Lindo man, discovered in 1,984 inches of Cheshire peat bog, died around 100 CE. Analysis revealed that he had been struck on the head, strangled, and then his throat was cut. But before death, he had eaten a meal of bread and honey. He was clean. He was dressed in fine clothing. He had been times prepared. Radiocarbon dating and isotope analysis confirm he was not a criminal or an outcast. He was, by all evidence, a member of the elite. Some scholars believe he was a sacrificial victim, a times rex, or times king times figure offered to ensure the fertility of the land. And yet no ancient text from this region describes the destination of such victims. The silence is itself a clue. Perhaps there was no need to describe where they went. Perhaps everyone already knew. Mainstream archaeology and anthropology have long explained these patterns through structural functionalism, the idea that human sacrifice serves social cohesion, elite power consolidation, or resource redistribution. In this view, the becoming gods narrative was a times rationalization, a story told by priests to justify killing. The victims were not really believed to ascend. They were political tools, their deaths used to terrorize populations into submission. This interpretation has been dominant since the 19th century. It is tidy, it is materialist. And it has a problem it cannot solve. The victims themselves seem to have times believed. In Mesoamerican codices, in Norse poetry, in Vedic hymns, the language used to describe the sacrificed is not the language of the condemned. It is the language of the times chosen. They are honored, they are transformed, they are mourned and celebrated in the same breath. The Aztec times, Ixtipla times, received worship before his death, not as a slave, not as a criminal, but as a living embodiment of the divine. How do you terrorize a population with a victim who is, by every account, considered holy? One detail that mainstream explanations consistently underweight: the times consent times given by many sacrificial victims. In Hindu tradition, the practice of times, sati times, though distinct from sacrifice, involved a widow's voluntary immolation on her husband's funeral pyre. And in the most ancient Vedic texts, the times Mahavrata, times ritual, involved figures who times chose times to be sacrificed. In symbolic reenactments, cosmic events, the Norse times Gotha, or priest chieftains, were said to be capable of self-death, a voluntary sacrifice that bound them to the land as times Landvatir, local spirits whose protection ensured harvests and victory in battle. Greek sources describe the times Thermopylae times volunteers, the 300 Spartans who chose certain death at the pass, and later Greeks considered them times demigods, beings who had crossed the threshold into permanent glory. The word volunteer is modern. The concept of times choosing times, divine transformation through sacrifice, is ancient. And it appears, independently, in cultures with no known contact. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern. What if we take the ancient accounts at their word? Not as literal descriptions of supernatural events, but as honest records of what people times experienced, times what they believed they witnessed when a human died on an altar, hung from a tree, or walked willingly into flame. The Aztec priests who wrote the Florentine Codex were not fools. The Norse poets who composed the Havamal were not primitives. These were literate, sophisticated observers recording phenomena they considered real. And what they recorded was this: that in the moment of ritual death, something changed in the victim. Something times left. Something that was, by every indication, more than the body. Call it consciousness. Call it spirit. Call it the times anima times mundi. In every tradition, the sacrifice is not merely a killing. It is a times, transfer times, a translocation of something divine from the human vessel into the cosmos itself. The victim becomes a god not because the gods intervene, but because humans, in these traditions, already times contained times something divine. Death was not a punishment. It was a times revelation. The sacrifice simply opened the door. We do not sacrifice humans on altars, or at least, we tell ourselves we do not. And yet the logic persists. We crown kings who die for nations. We lionize soldiers who fall in battle. We build monuments to those who gave everything. The language of sacrifice, of voluntary death as transformation, remains woven into the fabric of modern identity. Memorials are our temples. Eulogies are our hymns. The soldier who dies for country does not merely times perish. He times becomes times something. He joins the honored dead. He becomes eternal. We do not use the word God, but the structure is identical. We still believe, in some deep and unexamined way, that death in service of something larger than the self is a times transfiguration, that the sacrifice becomes the sacrifice times itself, times a permanent presence in the collective memory. An altar that never cools, So here is the question that no algorithm can answer and no excavation can settle. What did these ancient people actually feel times in those final moments? Did the Aztec times Ixipla times experience something beyond terror, a dissolution of self into something vaster, older, more real? Did the Norse volunteers who walked into battle knowing they would not return feel the world tree's roots beneath their feet, the runes glowing in their blood? We have their monuments, we have their texts, we have their bones. But the one thing we cannot recover is the subjective times experience the felt sense of becoming something other than human at the moment of human ending. And perhaps that is the true mystery. Not whether humans became gods, but whether we ever stopped believing we already were. Calm. Next. Time on Phantom Atlas. We descend into the underground cities of Cappadocia carved by early Christians into a labyrinthine network that could shelter 30,000 people. But who were they hiding from? And what did they find in the dark that made them keep digging? End of script. Word count. To 1,245,